Hello, I'm Kimberly Kirkpatrick, and this is Zachary Christian.
We're Safe Zones and Global Student Leaders here at Winthrop, and today we've invited Dr. Kiblinger to join us in a conversation about the general connections between homophobia and religion. He's a longstanding member of the Safe Zones Advisory Group, and thank you for being here with us.
I'm delighted to be here.
To get started, I think we should define homophobia and then work out how it relates to religion.
Good point. Homophobia refers to the aversion or fear of homosexuality. We may use it more broadly to refer to any feelings or thoughts of revulsion, disgust, disdain, prejudice, and hatred directed toward LGBT people.
And we should say that in terms of the caste model of identity development, the presence of homophobia in one's community hinders full identity synthesis. Being a fully integrated person requires a society that recognizes one's rights and one's worth.
Yes, exactly. So it's important that we understand what causes homophobia and how to overcome it. As for understanding it, I want to emphasize the part about homophobic feelings and thoughts.
Why is that?
It's one thing to have homophobic feelings and another thing to have homophobic thoughts. The two are related, but they're not the same thing. Let me illustrate this with a different type of example. Have you ever loved a song so much that you wanted a friend to like it as much as you do?
Sure, the other day I was trying to get a friend to like one of my favorite songs.
And how did that go?
Not so well. It wasn't that easy, and it just didn't come across.
Right. Sometimes we want someone to like something as much as we do, but there is a limit to how much we can do to affect another person's feelings.
Couldn't you just explain why the song's good?
It wasn't that easy.
And even if you could, explanations may not generate the feelings you want this friend to have. We can't simply use reasons to make someone have the passion we have.
So that's why you wanted to distinguish homophobic feelings from homophobic thoughts.
Because rethinking our beliefs is not the same as changing our feelings.
Exactly. There is a connection between reason and emotion, but thoughts never completely control our emotions. We may want to put an end to homophobic feelings that others have, but there's no direct way to alter another person's feelings. Reasons can influence feelings, but it's not like flipping a switch.
So what can Safe Zones do about the homophobia in our community and at Winthrop and more broadly in our culture?
I think we are doing it already, especially by telling your stories. They help people become more sympathetic. That's one of the reasons we study literature, to develop our imaginative capacity, to be able to imagine life from someone else's perspective and then feel sympathy. In addition to that, Safe Zones and its allies help us reflect on what causes people to have homophobic thoughts, with the aim of getting them to re-examine their beliefs and, in time, put their homophobic feelings in perspective. It's like when I'm mad at someone, but then I think about it and realize I have no real reason to be angry. That person is not at fault, I tell myself. I can then talk myself down from my anger, in a sense. My reflection has helped me put my emotion into the right perspective. This is what is sometimes called emotional intelligence.
I usually can't stand homophobic people, and dealing with them makes me kind of angry.
Yes, it can do that.
It's especially hard to deal with religious-based homophobia. Can you help us understand that and suggest how we should address it?
Yes, but it's a complicated problem. We have to remember that all religions exist in a culture, and all cultures have what we call a purity code. A cultural purity code describes whatever makes people in that culture have feelings of impurity, revulsion, or disgust. A feeling of revulsion or impurity is the basic feeling of yuck or gross that we have about something. Such feelings are not necessarily formal codes that are written down or thought about. Rather, they are feelings that provide some boundaries between what is acceptable and what is physically disgusting. For example, food is circumscribed by all sorts of boundaries separating the pure from the impure, or the acceptable from the gross. Many cultures, and therefore many religions, have encoded these boundaries in a set of food laws.
Are feelings of disgust or impurity different for different people?
Yes. One person may find one kind of food gross or revolting, and another may not. Indeed, one culture may find it common to eat, say, grasshoppers, while people in another culture would consider it disgusting and off limits.
So how does this relate to homophobia?
Yes, getting back to homophobia, we should remember that homophobia at its root derives from a feeling of revulsion related to some forms of sexuality. That is, it is a feeling that defines what is so impure that it is off limits. However, it is important to note that a purity code is not the same as a moral code.
Then what's the difference?
In everyday life, we know how they are different. Remember the example about eating grasshoppers? Just because people in one culture might think it's gross doesn't mean it's morally wrong.
So feeling that something is disgusting is not the same as saying it's wrong for everyone everywhere.
Exactly. My physical feeling of disgust about eating a grasshopper would not justify making a moral claim that it's wrong to do so. When we think about something we know is wrong, like the act of murder, we may feel a kind of moral disgust about it, but that's different from physical disgust.
Didn't the Supreme Court basically say that in its recent ruling of the Defense of Marriage Act?
Yes, exactly. Justice Anthony Kennedy, in his opinion, warned against trying to justify a law with a feeling of revulsion. Such a feeling, he said, would count as, quote unquote, an improper animus to motivate a law. In other words, physical disgust is not a legitimate basis for outlawing something.
It's easy to do, though, to think something is disgusting and then think it's wrong.
Yes, it is easy to slip from the physical feeling of disgust to moral condemnation. Part of the reason is that the two things can legitimately happen together.
Such as when?
Think of torture or child molestation. We might legitimately feel physical and moral disgust about them. However, the feeling of physical disgust about, say, molestation is not why it's wrong. It would be wrong even if we didn't feel physically disgusted by it.
Okay, so I can sometimes say that's disgusting and it's wrong, but I can't say it's wrong because it's disgusting?
Precisely. And the problem with many justifications of homophobia is that's exactly what's going on. It's wrong because it seems gross to me. In fact, neuroscience is discovering why that might be. Imagine eating a live cockroach. You would likely feel physical disgust. If you're imagining it now, you may be feeling it now. Now, imagine your nice grandmother losing her home to a foreclosure after being cheated by a sleazy mortgage broker. At this, you would likely feel moral disgust.
So what does neuroscience show us about these two examples?
Right. Both cases, it turns out, involve activation in the same area of the brain. It's called the insula. Essentially, we are having very similar brain events, even if we are experiencing two different types of things. That may explain why it's so easy to use feelings of physical disgust as the basis for moral condemnation.
Well, getting back to homophobia and religion, is that why people say homosexuality is a sin?
Right. Good question. The problem of confusing physical and moral disgust often arises in matters related to sexuality. In these cases, the feeling of revulsion first exists as a background feeling and then becomes formalized as a moral judgment. Let me offer an example from fairly recent American history. As recently as 1967, 17 states still enforced laws prohibiting interracial marriage. These laws were the institutionalized form of a long-standing purity feeling in American culture. Many people simply felt interracial marriage was gross. It made them feel queasy. And then their children were considered mixed and thus impure. Of course, by 1967, many other Americans did not feel this way and began to speak out against those who had this feeling of revulsion. And so the purity code became a matter of dispute rather than a background feeling that just goes without saying. When this happens, when a purity rule becomes conscious and disputed, we often see various attempts to rationalize what is really just a feeling of revulsion. And so we see the shift from feelings of revulsion to explicit thoughts that justify the feeling. In the case of interracial marriage, various pseudo-scientific claims were made. It's not natural, it's a disorder, it pollutes the races because one race is genetically inferior, etc. We also saw religious language being invoked. It defies God's plan to make separate races. It is therefore sinful, and various biblical texts were cited. Eventually, both types of justification, the pseudoscientific and the religious, were discredited, and much of the original feeling of disgust has dissipated in our society.
There's a lot of pseudoscience about LGBT people out there in our society.
Like being gay is a choice or it's a mental illness that can be cured.
Yes. And those sorts of justifications of homophobia have now been discredited by the vast community of social scientists and mental health professionals around the world.
So what about the people who use religion and specifically the Bible to justify their homophobia?
That's a good way of asking the question. The point is that their homophobic feelings may already be there, but when pressed to defend them, they may look for justifications from their religion. There's too much to cover in dealing with all the world's religions, but I will just note that Buddhism, for example, has a history of being much more flexible and accommodating to different sexualities. For now, though, let's stick to your question about the Bible.
It's always seemed to me that homophobic people use the Bible when it's convenient for them and ignore other parts that don't suit them.
Yes, cherry picking. Pulling out one passage and trumpeting it while ignoring surrounding passages that seem outmoded from other areas of ancient culture, such as the rules for ownership of women, the punishment of death for those who work on the Sabbath, or the ban on tattoos.
Aside from cherry picking, are these people making any other mistake in saying that homosexuality is sinful according to the Bible?
The full answer to this very good question will take longer than we have in this video, and that's why we are offering a second video to answer it in more detail. Briefly, though, for now, I would say yes, they are making a mistake. When we look more closely at a handful of passages in the Bible and read them in context, it turns out that the Bible does not proclaim homosexuality to be morally wrong. It simply does not call it a sin. That's because the Bible does not say anything about loving same-sex relationships at all. Through a variety of translation errors and misinterpretations, some readers have assumed that was what those few biblical passages were about, but they really are not.
So when we hear people claiming that the Bible condemns homosexuality, what's the best way we can respond?
There's no easy answer to this question, but remember our discussion of thoughts and feelings? First, correct any misunderstanding of the facts, such as the false idea that sexual orientation is a choice. If it's not a choice, it is much more difficult to understand it as a sin. Second, suggest that the Bible may not be as definitive as they assume. Many branches of the Jewish and Christian faiths have come to see this through ongoing biblical scholarship and are now, in fact, opposed to homophobia as a violation of the religious ethics.
Well, we'll leave it at that. We hope you will join us for the follow-up video on these parts of the Bible that often get used to justify homophobia.